Pan Tadeusz by Adam Mickiewicz. Every form of support is welcome and helps me continue working on my projects. Chapter 2. The Castle Argument. Hunting the Hare with Hounds. A Guest in the Castle. The last of the retainers tells the story of the last of the Horeszkos. A glance into the garden. The girl among the cucumbers. Breakfast. Pani Telemena's Saint. Petersburg story. New outbreak of the quarrel over bobtail and falcon. The intervention of Roback. The senescal's speech. The wager. Off for mushrooms. Who among us does not remember the years when, as a young lad, with his gun on his shoulder, he went whistling into the fields, where no rampart, no fence blocked his path, where, when you overstepped a boundary strip, you did not recognize it as belonging to another? For in Lithuania a hunter is like a ship upon the sea. Wherever he will, and by whatever path he will, he roams far and wide. Like a prophet he gazes on the sky, where in the clouds there are many signs that the hunter's eye can see, or like an enchanter he talks with the earth, which, though deaf to city dwellers, whispers into his ear with a multitude of voices. There a land rail calls from the meadow. It is vain to seek it, for it flees away through the grass like a pike in the Niemen. There above your head sounds the bell of early spring, the lark, hidden as deeply in the sky. There an eagle rustles with its broad wings through the airy heights, spreading terror among sparrows as a comet among stars. Or a hawk, hanging beneath the clear blue vault, flutters its wings like a butterfly impaled on a pin, until, catching sight in the meadow of a bird or a hare, it swoops upon it from on high like a falling star. When will the Lord God permit us to return from our wanderings, and again to dwell upon our ancestral fields, and to serve in the cavalry that makes war on rabbits, or in the infantry that bears arms against birds, to know no other weapons than the scythe and the sickle, and no other gazettes than the household accounts? Over Soplica arose the sun, and it already fell on the thatched roofs, and through the chinks stole into the stable, and over the fresh, dark green, fragrant hay of which the young men had made them a bed, streamed twinkling, golden bands from the openings of the black thatch, like ribbons from a braid of hair, and the sun teased the faces of the sleepers with its morning beams, like a village girl awakening her sweetheart with an ear of wheat. Already the sparrows had begun to hop and twitter beneath the thatch. Already the gander had cackled thrice, and after it, as an echo, the ducks and turkeys resounded in chorus, and one could hear the bellowing of the kine on their way to the fields. The young men had arisen. Thaddeus still lay dozing, for he had gone to sleep last of all. From the supper of the day before he had come back so disquieted that at cockcrow he had not yet closed his eyes, and on his couch he tossed about so violently that he sank into the hay as into water. At last he fell sound asleep. Finally a cool breeze blew in his eyes, when the creaking doors of the stable were opened with a crash, and the Bernardine, Father Roback, came in with his belt of knotted cord, calling out, "Surge, puer," and plying jocosely over his shoulders his knotted belt. Already in the yard could be heard the cries of the hunters. Horses were being led forth, wagons were coming up. Hardly could the yard contain such a throng. The horns sounded, they opened the kennels. The pack of hounds rushing out whined joyfully. Seeing the chargers of the huntsmen and the leashes of their keepers, the dogs as if mad scampered about the enclosure, then ran and put their necks in the collars. All this foreboded a very fine hunt. At last the chamberlain gave the order to proceed. The hunters started slowly, one after another, but beyond the gate they spread out in a long line. In the middle of it rode side by side the assessor and the notary, and though they occasionally cast a malicious glance at each other, they conversed in friendly fashion, like men of honor who were on their way to settle a mortal quarrel. No one from their words could have remarked their mutual hatred. The notary led bobtail, the assessor falcon. The ladies in carriages brought up the rear. The young men, galloping alongside near the wheels, talked with the ladies. Father Roback walked with slow steps about the yard, finishing his morning prayers, but he glanced at Thaddeus, frowned, smiled, and finally motioned to him with his finger. When Thaddeus rode up, Roback with his finger on his nose made him a threatening sign. But despite the requests and entreaties of Thaddeus that he would explain to him clearly what he meant, the Bernardine did not deign to answer, or even to look at him again. He merely pulled his cowl over his face and finished his prayer. So Thaddeus rode off and joined the guests. Just at that instant, the hunters were holding their leashes and all were standing motionless in their places. Each gave a sign to the other to be silent. And all had turned their eyes to a stone near which the judge had halted. He had caught sight of the game and was waving his arms in order to make his orders known. All understood him and stopped, and slowly across the field trotted the assessor and the notary. Thaddeus, being nearer, arrived before them, paused beside the judge, and gazed at the spot to which he was pointing. It was long since he had been in the field. On the gray expanse it was hard to distinguish the gray rabbit, especially amid the stones. The judge pointed him out. The poor hare was crouched cowering beneath a stone, pricking up its ears. With a crimson eye it met the gaze of the hunters, as if bewitched and conscious of its destiny. For very terror it could not turn its eye away from theirs, but beneath the rock crouched dead as a rock. Meanwhile the dust in the field came nearer and nearer. Bobtail was running in his leash, and after him the fleet falcon. Then the assessor and the notary shouted at once behind them, "At him," and vanished with the dogs in clouds of dust. While they were thus pursuing the hare, the Count made his appearance near the castle wood. All the neighbors knew that this gentleman could never present himself at the appointed time. Today also he had overslept, and was therefore in a scolding humor with his servants. Seeing the hunters in the field, he galloped towards them, with the skirts of his long white coat, of English cut, trailing in the wind. Behind him were mounted servants, wearing little black shiny caps like mushrooms, short jackets, striped boots, and white pantaloons. The servants whom the Count thus costumed in his mansion were called jockeys. The galloping train was rushing towards the meadows, when the Count caught sight of the castle and checked his horse. It was the first time that he had seen the castle so early, and he could not believe that these were the same walls, so wonderful a freshness and beauty had the early morning imparted to the outlines of the building. The Count marveled at so new a sight. The tower seemed to him twice as high, for it rose up above the early mist. The tin roof was gilded by the sun, and beneath it shone in the sashes fragments of the broken panes, breaking the eastern beams into many-colored rainbows. The lower stories were wrapped in a mantle of mist that hid from the eye the cracks and huge nicks. The cries of the distant hunters, borne on the winds, echoed several times against the castle walls. You would have sworn that the cry came from the castle, that under the curtain of fog the walls had been restored and were again inhabited. The Count liked new and unwanted sights, and called them romantic. He used to say that he had a romantic head, but truth to say he was an out-and-out crank. Sometimes when chasing a fox or a hare, he would suddenly stop and gaze mournfully at the sky, like a cat when it sees a sparrow on a tall pine. Often he wandered through the wood without dog or gun, like a runaway recruit. Often he sat by a brook motionless, inclining his head over a stream, like a heron that wants to consume all the fish with its eye. Such were the queer habits of the Count. Everybody said that there was some screw loose in him. Yet they respected him, for he was a gentleman of ancient lineage, rich, kind to his peasants, and affable and friendly with his neighbors, even with the Jews. The Count's horse, which he had turned off the road, trotted straight across the field to the threshold of the castle. The Count, left solitary, sighed, looked at the walls, took out paper and pencil, and began to draw. Thereupon, looking to one side, he saw a dozen steps away a man who seemed likewise a lover of the picturesque. With his head thrown back and his hands in his pockets, he seemed to be counting the stones with his eyes. The Count recognized him at once, but he had to call several times before Gerwazy heard his voice. He was a man of gentle birth, a servitor of the ancient lords of the castle, the last that remained of the Horeszkos retainers, a tall, gray-haired old man with a hale and rugged countenance, ploughed by wrinkles, gloomy and stem. Of old he had been famous among the gentry for his jollity, but since the battle in which the owner of the castle had perished, Gerwazy had changed, and now for many years he had not gone to any fair or merrymaking. Since then no one had heard his witty jests or seen a smile upon his face. He always wore the ancient livery of the Horeszkos, a long yellow coat with skirts, trimmed with lace that now was yellow, but once had doubtless been gilt. Around its edge was embroidered in silk their coat of arms, the half-goat, and thence all the neighbors had given the title of half-goat to the old gentleman. Sometimes also, from a phrase that he incessantly repeated, they called him my boy, sometimes Nachi, for his whole bald head was notched with scars. His real name was Rimbajlo, but no one knew his coat of arms. He called himself the warden, because years ago he had held that office in the castle. And he still wore a great bunch of keys at his girdle, on a band with a silver tassel, though he had nothing to open with them, for the gates of the castle stood gaping wide. However, he had found 2 folding doors, which he had repaired and set up at his own expense, and he amused himself daily with unlocking these doors. In one of the empty rooms he had chosen a habitation for himself. Though he might have lived at the Count's mansion on alms, he refused, for he pined away everywhere else, and felt out of sorts unless he was breathing the air of the castle. As soon as he caught sight of the Count, he snatched the cap from his head, and honored with a bow the kinsman of his lords, inclining a great bald pate that shone from afar and was slashed with many a sabre like a chopping block. He stroked it with his hand, came up, and once more bending low, said mournfully, "My boy, young master, pardon me, that I speak thus to your excellency the Count. Such is merely my custom, and it betokens no lack of respect. All the Horeszkos used to say my boy. The last pantler, my lord, was fond of the phrase. Is it true, my boy, that you grudge a penny for a lawsuit, and are yielding this castle to the Soplicas? I would not believe it, yet so they say all through the district." Here he gazed at the castle and sighed incessantly. "What is there strange in that?" said the Count. "The cost is great and the bother greater yet. I want to finish up, but the stupid old gentleman is obstinate. He foresaw that he could tire me out. Indeed, I cannot hold out longer, and today I shall lay down arms and accept such conditions of agreement as the court may offer me." "Of agreement?" cried Gerwazi. "Of agreement with the Soplicas?" "With the Soplicas, my boy." So speaking, he contorted his lips as though he were amazed at his own words. "Agreement with the Soplicas. My boy, young master, you are jesting, aren't you? The castle, the abode of the Horeszkos, pass into the hands of the Soplicas. Only deign to dismount from the steed. Let us go into the castle. Just look it over a bit. You do not know yourself what you are doing. Do not refuse. Dismount." And he held the stirrup for him to dismount. They entered the castle. Gerwazi stopped at the threshold of the hall. "Here," he said, "the ancient lords, surrounded by their retinue, used often to sit in their chairs after they had dined. The lord settled the disputes of the peasants, or good-humoredly told various curious stories to his guests, or found amusement in their tales and jests. But in the courtyard the young men fought with staves or broke in the master's Turkish ponies." They entered the hall. "In this immense paved hall," said Gerwazi, "you cannot find as many stones as tons of wine have been broached here in the good old times." The gentry, when invited to a diet, a district assembly, a family holiday, or a hunting party, would pull the casks from the wine cellar on their girdles. During the banquet, an orchestra was stationed in that gallery, and played the organ and various other instruments, and when they proposed a health, the trumpets thundered in chorus. The vivats followed in orderly succession, the first to the health of His Majesty the King, then to the primate, then to Her Majesty the Queen, then to the gentry and the whole republic. But finally, after the 5th glass had been drunk, they always proposed, "Let us love one another," a toast unceasing, which, proclaimed while daylight still lingered, thundered on till dawn, when horses and wagons stood ready to carry each guest to his lodging. They passed through several rooms. Gerwazi in silence now fixed his gaze on the wall and now on the vaulted ceiling, recalling now a sad and now a pleasant memory. Sometimes, as though he would say, "All is over," he bowed his head in sorrow. Sometimes he waved his hand. Evidently, even recollection was a torture to him, and he wished to drive it off. Finally they paused, in a large room on the upper story, once set with mirrors. Today, the mirrors had been removed and the frames stood empty. The sashes lacked their panes. Directly opposite the door was a balcony. Going out on it, the old man bowed his head in thought, and buried his face in his hands. When he uncovered it, it wore an expression of great sadness and despair. The Count, though he did not know what all this meant, when he looked at the face of the old man, felt a certain emotion and pressed his hand. The silence lasted for a moment. Then the old man broke it, shaking his uplifted right hand. "There can be no agreement, my boy, between the Soplica and the blood of the Horeszkos. In you flows the blood of the Horeszkos. You are a kinsman of the Pantler by your mother, the mistress of the hunt, whose mother was the child of the second daughter of the Castellan, who was, as is well known, the maternal uncle of my lord. Now listen to a story of your own family, which took place in this very room and no other. My late lord the Pantler, the first gentleman of the district, a rich man and of noted family, had but one child, a daughter beautiful as an angel. So not a few of the gentry and the young notables paid their court to the Pantler's daughter. Among the gentry there was one great roistering blade, a fighting bully, Tadeusz Soplica, who was called in jest the Wojewoda. In truth, he was of great influence in the Wojewodaship, for he had absolute authority over the whole family of the Soplicas, and controlled their 300 votes according to his will, although he himself possessed nothing except a little plot of ground, a saber, and great mustaches that stretched from ear to ear. So the Pantler often invited this ruffian to his place and entertained him there, especially at the time of the district diets, in order to make himself popular among the fellow's kinsmen and partisans. The mustachioed champion was so much elated by his courteous reception that he took it into his head that he might become his host's son-in-law. He came to the castle more and more frequently, even when uninvited, and finally settled down among us as if in his own home, and it seemed that he was on the point of declaring himself, but they remarked this and served him at the table with black soup. It may very well be that the Pantler's daughter had taken a fancy to the Soplica, but that she kept it a deep secret from her parents. Those were the times of Kosciuszko. My lord supported the Constitution of the 3rd of May, and was already gathering the gentry in order to go to the aid of the Confederates, when suddenly the Muscovites encircled the castle by night. There was barely time to fire an alarm signal from the mortar, and to close the gates below and fasten them with a bar. There was no one in the whole castle except the Pantler, myself, and the lady, the cook and 2 turnspits, all 3 drunk, the parish priest, a serving man, and 4 footmen, all bold fellows. So to arms and to the windows. Here a throng of Muscovites came streaming across the terrace to the door, shouting hurrah, but we met them with bullets from 10 guns. Back with you! Nothing could be seen. The servants shot without cessation from the lower stories, and my lord and I from the balcony. All went finely, although amid such great alarm. 20 guns lay here on this floor. We shot one, and they handed us another. The parish priest attended diligently to this task, and the lady and her daughter, and the serving maids. There were but 3 marksmen, yet the fire was unceasing. The Muscovite Boers showered on us a hail of bullets from below. We replied from above sparsely, but with better aim. 3 times that rabble pressed up to the door, but each time 3 of them bit the dust, so they fled behind the storehouse. It was already early dawn. With a cheerful face the Pantler came out on the balcony with his gun, and whenever a Muscovite thrust forth his brow from behind the storehouse he at once fired, and he never missed. Each time a black helmet fell on the grass, so that at length scarcely a man crept out from behind the wall. The Pantler, seeing his enemies in confusion, thought of making a sally. He seized his saber, and shouting from the balcony, gave orders to the servants. Turning to me, he said, "Follow me, Gerwazy." At that instant there was a shot from behind the gate. The Pantler's speech faltered. He turned red, turned pale, tried to speak, spat blood. Then I perceived that he had received the bullet full in the breast. My lord, tottering, pointed towards the gate. I recognized that villain Soplica. I recognized him, by his stature and by his mustaches. By his shot the Pantler had perished. I saw it. The villain still held his gun raised aloft. Smoke still came from the barrel. I sighted at him. The brigand stood as if petrified. Twice I fired, and both shots missed, whether from hatred or from grief. I aimed ill. I heard the shrieks of women. I looked around. My lord was no longer living. Here Gerwazy paused and burst into a flood of tears. Then he concluded, "The Muscovites had already broken down the door, for after the death of the Pantler I stood helpless and did not know what was going on around me. Luckily to our help came Parafianovich, bringing from Horeszkos 200 of the Mickiewicz, who are a numerous and a valiant family of gentry, every man of them, and nourish an immemorial hatred of the Soplicas. Thus perished a powerful, pious, and just lord, whose ancestors had held seats in the Senate, worn badges of honor, and carried the hetman's staff of office, a father to his peasants, a brother to the gentry, and he had no son left after him to vow vengeance on his grave. But he had faithful servants. With the blood of his wound I whet my broadsword, called the penknife. You have surely heard of my penknife, famous at every diet, market, and village assembly, and swore to notch it on the shoulders of the Soplicas. I pursued them at diets, forays, and fairs. 2 I hewed down in a brawl, 2 others in a duel. 1 I burnt in a wooden building, when with Rimza we sacked Koralich. He was baked like a mudfish, but those whose ears I have cut off I cannot count. 1 only is left who has not yet received a reminder from me. He is the own dear brother of that mustachioed bully. He still lives and boasts of his wealth. The edge of his field borders on the Horeszkos castle. He is respected in the district. He has an office. He is a judge. And you will yield the castle to him? Shall his base feet wipe the blood of my lord from this floor? No. While Gerwazi has but a pennyworth of spirit, and enough strength to move even with 1 little finger his penknife, which still hangs on the wall, never shall a Soplica get this castle. Oh, cried the Count, raising his hands on high, I had a fair foreboding that I loved these walls, though I knew not that they contained such treasures, so many dramatic memories, and so many tales. When once I seize from the Soplicas the castle of my ancestors, I will establish you within its walls as my burgrave. Your tale, Gerwazi, has mightily affected me. I regret that you did not lead me here at the hour of midnight. Draped in my cloak I should have sat upon the ruins, and you would have told me of bloody deeds. I regret that you have no great gift of narration. Often have I heard, and often do I read such traditions. In England and Scotland every lord's castle, in Germany every count's mansion was the theatre of murders. In every ancient, noble, powerful family there is a report of some bloody or treacherous deed, after which vengeance descends as an inheritance to the heirs. In Poland for the first time do I hear of such an incident. I feel that in me flows the blood of the manly Horeszkos. I know what I owe to glory and to my family. So be it. I must break off all negotiations with the Soplica, even though it should come to pistols or to the sword. Honor bids me. He spoke and moved on with solemn steps, and Gerwazi followed in deep silence. Before the gate the Count stopped, mumbling to himself. Gazing at the castle, he quickly mounted his horse, and thus in distraction he concluded his monologue. I regret that this old Soplica has no wife or fair daughter whose charms I might adore. If I loved her and could not obtain her hand, a new complication would arise in the tale. Here the heart, their duty. Here vengeance, their love. So whispering he applied the spurs, and the horse flew towards the judge's mansion, just as the hunters came riding out of the wood from the other direction. The Count was fond of hunting. Hardly had he perceived the riders when, forgetting everything, he galloped straight towards them, passing by the yard gate, the orchard, and the fences. But at a turn of the path he looked around and checked his horse near the fence. It was the kitchen garden. Fruit trees planted in rows shaded a broad field. Beneath them were the vegetable beds. Here sat a cabbage, which bowed its venerable bald head and seemed to meditate on the fate of vegetables. There, intertwining its pods with the green tresses of a carrot, a slender bean turned upon it 1,000 eyes. Here the maize lifted its golden tassels. Here and there could be seen the belly of a fat watermelon that had rolled far from its parent stalk into a distant land, as a guest among the crimson beets. The beds were intersected by furrows. In each trench there stood, as if on guard, ranks of hemp stalks, the cypresses of the vegetable garden, calm, straight, and green. Their leaves and their scent served to defend the beds, for through their leaves no serpent dares to press, and their scent kills insects and caterpillars. Farther away towered up the whitish stalks of poppies. On them you might think a flock of butterflies had perched, fluttering their wings, on which flashed, with all the colors of the rainbow, the gleam of precious stones. With so many different, living tints did the poppies allure the eye. Amid the flowers, like the full moon amid the stars, a round sunflower, with a great glowing face, turned after the sun from the east to the west. Beside the fence stretched long, narrow, rounded hillocks, free from trees, bushes, and flowers. This was the cucumber patch. They had grown finely. With their great, spreading leaves they covered the beds as with a wrinkled carpet. Amid them walked a girl, dressed in white, sinking up to her knees in the May greenery. Stepping down from the beds into the furrows, she seemed not to walk but to swim over the leaves and to bathe in their bright color. Her head was shaded with a straw hat. From her brow there waved 2 pink ribbons and some tresses of bright, loose hair. In her hands she held a basket, and her eyes were lowered. Her right hand was raised as if to pluck something. As a little girl when bathing tries to catch the fishes that sport with her tiny feet, so she at every instant bent down with her hands and her basket to gather the cucumbers against which she brushed with her foot, or of which her eye caught sight. The Count, struck with so marvelous a sight, stood still. Hearing from afar the trampling of his comrades, he motioned to them with his hand to stop their horses. They halted. He gazed with outstretched neck, like a long-billed crane that stands apart from the flock on one leg, keeping guard with watchful eyes, and holding a stone in the other foot, in order not to fall asleep. The Count was awakened by a pattering on his shoulders and brow. It was the Bernardine, Father Roback, who held aloft in his hand the knotted cords of his belt. "Will you have cucumbers?" he cried. "Here they are." So saying, he showed him the knots on his belt, which were shaped like cucumbers. "Look out for danger. In this garden patch there is no fruit for you. Nothing will come of it." Then he threatened him with his finger, adjusted his cowl, and departed. The Count tarried on the spot a moment more, cursing and yet laughing at this sudden hindrance. He glanced at Di Garden, but she was no longer in the garden. Only her pink ribbon and her white gown flashed through the window. On the garden bed one could see the path by which she had flown, for the green leaves, spurned by her foot in her flight, raised themselves and trembled an instant before they became quiet, like water cut by the wings of a bird. Only on the place where she had been standing, her abandoned willow basket, empty and overturned, was still poised upon the leaves and tossing amid the green waves. An instant later all was silent and deserted. The Count fixed his eyes on the house and strained his ears. Still he mused, and still the huntsman stood motionless behind him. Then in the quiet, deserted house arose first a murmur, then an uproar and merry cries, as in an empty hive when bees fly back into it. That was a sign that the guests had returned from hunting, and that the servants were busying themselves with breakfast. Through all the rooms there reigned a mighty bustle. They were carrying about platters, plates of food, and bottles. The men, just as they had come in their green suits, walked about the rooms with plates and glasses, and ate and drank, or, leaning against the window casements, they talked of guns, hounds, and hares. The chamberlain and his family and the judge were seated at the table. In a corner, the young ladies whispered together. There was no such order as is observed at dinners and suppers. In this old-fashioned Polish household, this was a new custom. At breakfasts the judge, though loth, permitted such disorder, but he did not commend it. There were likewise different dishes for the ladies and for the gentlemen. Here they carried around trays with an entire coffee service, immense trays, charmingly painted with flowers, and on them fragrant, smoking tin pots, and golden cups of Dresden china, and with each cup a tiny little jug of cream. In no other country is there such coffee as in Poland. In Poland, in a respectable household, a special woman is, by ancient custom, charged with the preparation of coffee. She is called the coffee maker. She brings from the city, or gets from the river barges, berries of the finest sort, and she knows secret ways of preparing the drink, which is black as coal, transparent as amber, fragrant as mocha, and thick as honey. Everybody knows how necessary for coffee is good cream. In the country this is not hard to get, for the coffee maker, early in the day, after setting her pots on the fire, visits the dairy, and with her own hands lightly skims the fresh flour of the milk into a separate little jug for each cup, that each of them may be dressed in its separate little cap. The older ladies had risen earlier and had already drunk their coffee. Now they had made for them a second dish, of warm beer, whitened with cream, in which swam curds cut into little bits. The gentlemen had their choice of smoked meats, fat half geese, hams, and slices of tongue, all choice, all cured in home fashion in the chimney with juniper smoke. Finally, they brought in stewed beef with gravy as the last course. Such was breakfast in the judge's house. In adjoining rooms, 2 separate companies had gathered. The older people, grouped about a small table, talked of new ways of farming and of the new imperial edicts, which were growing more and more severe. The chamberlain discussed the current rumors of war, and based on them conclusions as to politics. The seneschal's daughter, putting on blue spectacles, amused the chamberlain's wife by telling fortunes with cards. In the other room, the younger men talked over the hunt in a more calm and quiet fashion than was usually the case, for the assessor and the notary, both mighty orators, the foremost experts on the chase and the best huntsmen, sat opposite each other, glum and angry. Both had set on their hounds well. Both had felt certain of victory, when in the middle of the field there turned up a patch of unreaped spring corn belonging to a peasant. Into this the hare fled. Bobtail and Falcon were each about to seize it, when the judge checked the horsemen at the border of the field. They had to obey, although in great wrath. The dogs returned without their prey, and no one knew for sure whether the beast had escaped or had been caught. No one could guess whether it had fallen into the clutches of Bobtail, or of Falcon, or of both at once. The 2 sides held different opinions, and the settlement of the quarrel was postponed to the future. The old seneschal passed from room to room, glancing absent-mindedly about him. He mixed neither in the talk of the hunters nor in that of the old men, and evidently had something else on his mind. He carried a leather flapper. Sometimes he would stop, meditate long, and kill a fly on the wall. Thaddeus and Telemina, standing on the threshold in the doorway between the rooms, were talking together. No great distance divided them from hearers, so they whispered. Thaddeus now learned that Aunt Telemina was a rich lady, that they were not so near of kin as to be separated by the canons of the church, that it was not even certain that Aunt Telemina was any blood relation of her nephew, although his uncle called her sister, because their common kindred had once so styled them despite the difference of their years, that later, during her long residence in the capital, she had rendered inestimable services to the judge, for which reason the judge greatly respected her, and in society liked, perhaps as a mere whim, to call himself her brother, which Telemina, for friendship's sake, did not forbid him. These confessions lightened the heart of Thaddeus. They also informed each other of other things, and all this happened in one short, brief moment. But in the room to the right, tempting the assessor, the notary casually remarked, "I said yesterday that our hunting party could not succeed. It is still too early, the grain is still in the ear, and there are many strips of unreaped spring corn belonging to the peasants. For this reason the Count did not come, despite our invitation. The Count has an excellent knowledge of the chase. He has often discoursed of the proper time and places for hunting. The Count from childhood up has dwelt in foreign parts, and he says that it is a mark of barbarism to hunt, as we do, with no regard to laws, ordinances, and government regulations, to ride over another man's estate without the knowledge of the owner, without respecting any man's landmarks or boundaries, to course the fields and woods in spring as well as in summer, sometimes to kill a fox just when it is molting, or to allow the hounds to run down a pregnant hare in the winter corn, or rather to torture it with great damage to the game. Hence the Count admits with regret that civilization is on a higher plane among the Muscovites, for there they have ukases of the Tsar on hunting, and police supervision and punishment for offenders." "As I love my mother," said Telemina, turning to the left-hand room and fanning her shoulders with a small batiste handkerchief. "The Count is not mistaken. I know Russia well. You people would not believe me when I used to tell you in how many respects the watchfulness and strictness of that government are worthy of praise. I have been in St. Petersburg more than once or twice. Tender memories, charming images of the past. What a city! Have none of you been in St. Petersburg? Perhaps you would like to see a map of it. I have a map of the city in my desk. In summer, St. Petersburg society usually lives in dakas, that is, in rural palaces. Dacha means cottage. I lived in a little palace just above the river Neva, not too near the city and not too far from it, on a small artificial hill. Ah, what a cottage that was! I still have the plan in my desk. Now, to my misfortune, a certain petty official who was serving on an inquest hired a house nearby. He kept several hounds. What torture when a petty official and a kennel live close by! Whenever I went out into the garden with a book to enjoy the light of the moon and the coolness of the evening, immediately a dog would rush up and wag its tail and prick up its ears as if it were mad. I was often terrified. My heart foreboded some misfortune from those dogs, and so it came to pass. For when I went into the garden on a certain morning, a hound throttled at my feet my beloved little King Charles Spaniel. Ah, he was a lovely little dog. Prince Sukin gave him to me as a present to remember him by. Clever and lively as a squirrel. I have his portrait, only I don't want to go to my desk now. Seeing it strangled, owing to my great distress, I had a fainting spell, spasms, palpitation of the heart. Perhaps my health might have suffered even more severely. Luckily, just then there rode up on a visit Kirilo Gavrilich Kozadusin, the master of the hunt of the court, who inquired the cause of so serious an attack. He had the police sergeant pulled in by the ears. The man stood there pale, trembling, and scarcely alive. "How dare you?" shouted Kirilo with a voice of thunder. "Course in spring a pregnant doe, here under the nose of the Tsar." The amazed sergeant in vain swore that he had not yet begun his hunting, and that with the august permission of the master of the hunt, the beast coursed seemed to him to be a dog and not a doe. "What?" shouted Kirilo. "Do you dare, you scoundrel, to say that you have more knowledge of hunting and the varieties of beasts than I, Kozodusin, the Tsar's Jägermeister? The chief of police shall at once pass judgment between us." They summoned the chief of police and told him to take down the evidence. "I," said Kozodusin, "hereby testify that this is a doe. He impudently alleges that it is a domestic dog. Judge between us, which of us better understands beasts and hunting." The chief of police understood the duties of his office, and was greatly amazed at the insolence of the sergeant. Taking him aside, he gave him brotherly advice to plead guilty, and thereby atone for his offense. The master of the hunt was mollified and promised that he would intercede with the emperor and somewhat mitigate the sentence. The matter ended by the dogs being sent to be strangled, and the sergeant to prison for 4 weeks. This trifle amused us the whole evening. The next day the story spread abroad that the master of the hunt had taken up the case of my little dog, and I even know for a fact that the emperor himself laughed over it. Laughter arose in both rooms. The judge and the Bernardine were playing at marriage. Spades were trumps, and the judge was just about to make an important play. The monk could hardly breathe for excitement when the judge caught the beginning of the story, and was so interested in it that with head thrown back and card uplifted, ready to take the trick, he sat quiet and only alarmed the Bernardine, until, when the story was ended, he played his knave, and said with a laugh, "Let whoever will praise the civilization of the Germans, or the strict discipline of the Muscovites, let the men of Great Poland learn from the Swabians to go to law over a fox, and summon constables to arrest a hound that has ventured into another man's grove. In Lithuania, thank the Lord, we keep up the old ways. We have enough game for ourselves and for our neighbors, and shall never complain to the police about it. And we have enough grain so that the dogs will not famish us by running through the spring wheat or the rye. On the peasants' fields alone do I forbid hunting." "It is no wonder, sir," called the steward from the room at the left, "since you pay dear for such game. The peasants are glad of the chance. When a dog runs into their wheat, if he shakes out 10 ears, then you repay 60 and are not content even with that. Often the boors get a thaler into the bargain. Believe me, sir, that the peasants will grow very insolent if—" The rest of the steward's argument the judge could not hear, for between the two discourses there had begun a dozen conversations, jests, stories, and even disputes. Thaddeus and Telemina had been forgotten by all the rest of the company, and were absorbed in each other. The lady was glad that her wit had amused Thaddeus so greatly. In return, the young man showered compliments on her. Telemina spoke more and more slowly and softly, and Thaddeus pretended that he could not hear her in the buzz of voices. So, whispering, he drew so near her that he felt on his face the pleasant warmth of her brow. Holding his breath, he caught her sighs with his lips, and with his eye he followed every sparkle of her glance. Then between them there suddenly darted first a fly, and after it the seneschal's flapper. In Lithuania there are swarms of flies. Among them there is a special variety called gentry flies. In color and form they are quite like others, but they have a broader breast, a larger belly than the common sort. As they fly they hum loudly and buzz beyond all endurance, and they are so strong that they will break right through a spider's web. Or if one is caught, it will buzz there for 3 days, for it can contend with the spider in single combat. All this the seneschal had carefully observed, and he argued further that these gentry flies produce the smaller folk, corresponding among flies to the queen bee in a swarm, and that with their destruction the remnant of those insects would perish. To be sure, neither the housekeeper nor the parish priest had ever believed these deductions of the seneschal, but held quite different views as to the nature of flies. The seneschal, however, did not waver from his ancient habit. Whenever he caught sight of such a fly, he immediately pursued it. Just at that moment a gentleman trumpeted above his ear. Twice the seneschal swung at it, and to his amazement missed. A third time he swung at it, and almost knocked out a window. At last the fly, bewildered by such an uproar, seeing on the threshold 2 people that barred his retreat, threw itself in desperation between their faces. Even there the right hand of the seneschal darted in pursuit of it. The blow was so violent that the 2 heads sprang apart like the 2 halves of a tree torn asunder by a thunderbolt. Both bumped against the doorposts so violently that they got black and blue spots. Luckily no one noticed this, for the conversation, which hitherto had been lively and animated, but fairly orderly, ended in a sudden clamorous outburst. As when fox hunters are entering a wood, one hears from time to time the crackling of trees, scattered shots, and the baying of the pack. But then the master of the hounds unexpectedly starts the game. He gives the signal, and a hubbub arises in the throng of huntsmen and dogs, as if every tree of the thicket had found a voice. Such is the case with conversation. It moves on slowly until it happens on a weighty topic, as dogs on the game. The game of the hunters' talk was that furious dispute of the notary and the assessor over their famous hounds. It lasted only a short time, but they accomplished much in a single instant, for in one breath they hurled so many words and insults that they exhausted the usual 3/4 of a dispute, taunts, anger, and challenge, and were already getting ready to use their fists. So all rushed towards them from the other room, and, pouring through the doorway like a swift wave, carried away the young couple who were standing on the threshold like Janus, the 2-headed god. Before Thaddeus and Telemina could smooth the hair on their heads, the threatening shouts had died away. A murmur mixed with laughter was spreading through the throng. A truce had come to the brawl. The monk had appeased it, an old man, but strong, and with very broad shoulders. Just as the assessor had run up to the jurist, and when the combatants were already making threatening gestures at each other, he suddenly seized them both by the collar from behind, and twice knocking their 2 heads violently together like Easter eggs, he spread out his arms like a signpost, and tossed them at the same moment into opposite corners of the room. For a moment he stood still with outstretched arms, and cried, "Pax, pax, pax vobiscum, peace be with you." Both factions were amazed and even began to laugh. Because of the respect due to a cleric, they did not dare to revile the monk, and after such a test, no one had any desire to start a quarrel with him. And Father Roback soon calmed the assembly. It was evident that he had not sought any triumph. He did not further threaten the 2 brawlers or scold them. He only adjusted his cowl, and, tucking his hands into his belt, quietly left the room. Meanwhile, the chamberlain and the judge had taken a stand between the 2 factions. The seneschal, as if aroused from deep thought, stepped into their midst and ran his fiery eye over the assembly. Wherever he still heard a murmur, there he waved soothingly his leather flapper, as a priest his sprinkler. Finally, raising impressively the handle of it on high like a marshal's staff, he imposed silence. "Hold your peace," he repeated, "and bear in mind, you who are the foremost hunters in the district, what will come of a scandalous brawl. Are you aware? These young men, in whom is the hope of our country, who are to bring fame to our groves and forests, who, alas, even now neglect the chase, may receive thereby a new impulse to despise it, if they see that those who should give examples to others bring back from the chase only wrangling and quarrels. Have also due regard for my gray hairs, for I have known greater sportsmen than you, and I have often judged between them as an arbitrator. In the Lithuanian forests who has been equal to Regtan, either in stationing a line of beaters or in himself encountering the beast? Who can compare himself with Jerzy Bielopietrowicz? Where is there such a marksman today as Zagoda, who with a pistol shot could hit a rabbit on the run? I knew Tereyevich, who, when he went out for wild boars, took no other arms than a pike, and Budrovich, who used to fight singly against a bear. Such men did our forests once behold. If it came to a dispute, how did they settle the dispute? Why, they chose judges and set up stakes. Oginsky lost 3,000 acres of woodland over a wolf, and a badger cost Niesielowski several villages. Now do you gentlemen follow the example of your elders, and settle your dispute in this way, even though you may set up a smaller stake. Words are wind. To wordy disputes there is no end. It is a shame to tire our ears longer with a brawl over a rabbit. So do you first choose arbitrators, and whatever their verdict may be, conscientiously abide by it. I will beg the judge not to forbid the master of the hounds to lead the chase even across the wheat, and I hope that I shall obtain this favor from my lord. So saying, he embraced the knees of the judge. A horse! Shouted the notary. I will stake a horse with his caparison, and I will further covenant before the local court that I deposit this ring as a reward for our arbitrator, the judge. I, said the assessor, will stake my golden dog collars, covered with lizard skin, with rings of gold, and my leash of woven silk, the workmanship of which is as marvelous as the jewel that glitters upon it. That outfit I wish to leave as an inheritance to my children, if I should marry. That outfit was given me by Prince Dominic Radziwill, when once I hunted with him and with Prince Marshal Sangusko and General Mejan, and when I challenged them all to course their hounds with me. There, something unexampled in the history of the chase, I captured 6 hares with a single bitch. We were then hunting on the meadow of Kupisko. Prince Radziwill could not keep his seat upon his horse, but dismounting, embraced my famous hound Kania, and thrice kissed her on the head. And then, thrice patting her on the muzzle, he said, I dub thee henceforward Princess of Kupisko. Thus does Napoleon give principalities to his generals from the places at which they have gained great victories. Telemina, wearied with the prolonged wrangling, wanted to go out into the fresh air, but sought a partner. She took a little basket from the peg. Gentlemen, I see that you wish to remain within doors, she said, wrapping around her head a red cashmere shawl. But I am going for mushrooms. Follow me who will. Under one arm, she took the little daughter of the chamberlain. With the other, she raised her skirt up to her ankles. Thaddeus silently hastened after her, to seek mushrooms. The plan of a walking party was very welcome to the judge, who saw in it a means of settling a noisy dispute. So he called out, Gentlemen, to the woods for mushrooms. The one who brings the finest to the table I will seat beside the prettiest girl. I will pick her out myself. If a lady finds it, she shall choose for herself the handsomest young man.
Remember to subscribe.